Friends, welcome to the 16th lecture in module 3. Where we will focus on risk and hazard assessment. As a summary, this is actually the 16th lecture in module 3, where we are focusing on risk assessment and reliability applications. We already said that risk assessment can be done in two ways. One is quantified manner, other is in a qualitative manner. In both ways, risk should ultimately lead to an economic perspective. It should also interestingly tell me the priority of risk elements involved in a given system. On the whole, risk assessment actually is an extension of hazard, because hazard is a scenario present in a given situation, whereas risk is realization of an hazard. So, risk assessment is a mathematical approach which we saw. Is a mathematical approach which is generally practiced by engineers to predict the risk of accidents. So, risk assessment actually is one of the prediction tools. It gives guidance on appropriate means of minimizing them. So, this can be also considered as a guidance to minimize the consequences of risk. So, there are two ways, my dear friends. One, risk by itself can be minimized if you have a system where the risk presence is inevitable, unavoidable, unintentional, as in the case of offshore structure. Try to reduce the consequences. So, okay, anyway, both are risk management. Risk assessment also uses scientific methods, logical techniques like logical tree, etc., based on verifiable data, whereas hazard is actually a scenario, is a situation, is a condition which may lead to risk initiation. So, in risk management, hazard assessment or hazard identification, hazard evaluation, hazard management and control will all be preliminary steps. So, amongst all, the foremost thing can be hazard identification. This kind of study is especially called as hazard identification, hazard studies. It actually consists of qualitative review of possible accidents to occur, that may occur. It is actually based on experience. It uses engineering judgment. Wherever applicable. There are several formats by which one can perform hazard or hazard identification. They are useful to give a qualitative appreciation of the range and magnitude of the hazards. So, hazard statements produces a qualitative outcome about the magnitude of the hazard and the range. In a given system. Once a system is qualitatively reviewed and one is able to identify the hazards present in the given system in terms of the range of the hazard as well as its magnitude, then the next step comes hazard management, because now we need to manage this hazard. Hazard management actually deals with indicating or recommending appropriate measures to mitigate the hazards. Therefore, hazard identification forms a very important step in hazard management, but the basic difficulty is the more precise purpose of selecting a list of possible failure cases are necessary for qualitative modeling. So, instead of identifying the hazards, a better alternative could be to list the possible failures and their possible causes and their consequences. Maybe all of them qualitatively. Interestingly, once the hazards are identified, to manage the hazards one need to do one more study in addition to this parallel. Let us see what is that. We already studied in risk assessment that consequence analysis is a very important step, because it gives a micro window appreciation about the series of consequences that can arise from different modes of failure in a given system. Parallel to that, to manage hazards in an effective manner, one also does what is called frequency analysis. Frequency analysis actually estimates how likely the accidents are to occur. It estimates, let us say, the likelihood of occurrence of accidents. It is usually obtained from the analysis of previous accident experiences. So, it is actually based on case studies of previous, let us say, similar accidents. So, it is more or less a theoretical model. consequence analysis is then followed parallel, which we already saw in detail, but still for completion's sake let us write that. Consequence analysis is also an equally important step. It evaluates the resulting effects if the accidents occur. It is a micro window to view detailed effects of accidents in performance failure of the system, in economic perspective, in safety perspective, in re-engineering perspective, because it may sometimes lead to redesigning a component or an element or a process line, or may be essentially based on engineering judgment. So, estimate of consequences of each possible event often requires some form of computer modeling, but may be essentially based on accident case study experiences or engineering judgments as far as their application is concerned in terms of understanding them for the consequences in the real problem. Now, when the frequency analysis and consequence analysis are complete, or completed, then one can look for a combined effect of this. Which we call as overall risk. Now, various forms of risk presentation may be used in analytical modeling to assess risk in a given system. Risk to life is generally looked at most important consideration. Therefore, hazard management should lead to identifying clearly the presence of risk, or to be very precise, avoidance of risk. The moment I say risk is present, it may essentially come from challenging of safety, the moment it is challenging of safety, then risk to life is under consideration, apart from risk to the economic perspective of plants, machineries, etc. The moment you talk about risk to life, then it can be expressed in two complementary ways. Risk to life can be expressed in two ways. One is what is called individual risk, it is the risk experienced by any individual person working in the plant, the other alternative is societal risk. This is the risk experienced by whole group of people exposed to the hazard. So, there are two forms by which risk can be expressed now. One is on individual perspective, other is on societal perspective. So, friends, let us now look at an interesting flow chart of QRA. Please pay attention to the flow chart shown on the screen now. Let us decide what is the study basis we are looking at. For any study basis for a system, we have to identify or define the system first. Before defining the system, please understand it is an important step. One should always define the risk acceptance criteria. So, the risk acceptance criteria does not depend on the system definition at all. It is a prior to the study basis. So, depending upon the study basis, one first decides what is the acceptance criteria of risk. So, parallelly you identify the system. For a given system, conduct hazard studies, that is hazard identification, and identify the studies. In parallel, do also frequency analysis and consequence analysis, as just now we discussed. Combined together, we will get what is called as a risk picture. Once you get the risk picture, let us try to see whether the risk obtained from a given system is acceptable, because you will compare this with acceptable level what is being predefined even much before the start of the problem. If the risk is acceptable, then you proceed and do for further risk reducing measures if they are reasonably practical, as we saw in the last lecture. If the risk acceptable is not within the threshold values of the acceptable criteria, then employ risk reducing measures, go back to the new system definition and proceed the same chart back again. So, it is very important in a given system, the QRA focus essentially on risk reduction or limiting risk within tolerable reasonable limits. So, any qualitative or quantitative risk assessment tools should aim to limit risk within the tolerable limits, to be very precise within risk acceptance limits. Please understand risk acceptance limits are predefined by regulatory bodies. They are not system dependent. They are governed by Environmental Protection Authority rules, which should be followed and agreed upon by the oil companies. So, if you look more in detail about the hazard identification, interestingly friends, hazard identification becomes also a part of risk assessment, because ultimately hazard identified will be analyzed for frequency and consequences of those hazards, and which will lead to a combined picture of risk. Therefore, hazard identification is a formal part of risk assessment. Basically, it is a first step to identify or evaluate risk in the form of hazard. it is important to identify the hazards that are inherent in the process. So, hazards are more vulnerable in process than design. In fact, in production than design, because hazards are scenarios which can become vulnerable when the operational temperature and pressure and operational conditions keep on varying, which can challenge the safety of a given person in a given situation. Therefore, evaluation of hazards is closely related to the process conditions or the production conditions prevailing in the plant all through. So, based on detailed investigation and hazard identification, an event list is generated. We already know what are the different kinds of events, initiating, triggering event, etc. They are generated, which considers various potential sources of accidents. For example, it can be leaks, cracks, structural failure, release of chemicals, large inventory, electrical short circuiting. I mean, you can have a long list of examples where you can generate an event list based on the hazards identified in a given plant when the plant is in production or process line. The compiled list can include the pipeline works, the vessels in direct communication with the process, because they share lot of significant inventory details which cannot be isolated in the event of emergency. That is very important. The following data may be necessary to envisage a various failure scenario. Let us say I want to know what are the data necessary to foresee different failure scenario. One can say composition of material, which is essentially flowing in the pipeline, may be stored in the vessel, etc. Also, inventory of material which is stored in the plant, inventory in terms of its volume, location, etc. Then flow rate of material, passing through the pipelines, then operational parameters like temperature, pressure, etc. Then also storage tanks, pipelines, layout, etc. all should be studied in detail, so that failure scenarios can be identified and detailed event list can be prepared for the logical risk analysis. In addition to this, one should also look at possible release scenarios for a given stream of process. It can start from a pinhole leak up to a catastrophic failure rupture of a vessel or a full bore rupture of a given pipeline. Interestingly, identifying these kind of lists qualitatively and quantifying them and then doing a frequency and consequence analysis is highly time consuming. Therefore, what generally one does is limit the failure cases based on character of each unit. So, this comes from more or less engineering judgment and process or product or production expertise. So, based on this, you do not have to prepare an exhaustive list of all possible failure scenarios, only pick and choose those failure cases which are seriously limited to that kind of character of the plant or the segment of the plant which you already know based upon your experience and production judgment or your engineering judgment. So, use this as the tool, so that in hazard management which is a primary step in risk assessment, human intervention plays a very important role in terms of modifying or mitigating or actuating the risk presence in a given plant. So, it becomes very important, friends, that individual person need to be trained, need to be educated about all the history of accidents and risk assessments in detail, so that he gains knowledge, he gains experience in a given production system both in design and process layout. Therefore, at any given point of time he should be equipped to identify the list of events which are very serious enough to cause potential loss or become potential sources of various accidents which can result from different failure scenarios. So, on the whole, to really do a risk assessment effectively, one need to have an excellent capacity building. One should understand basically the design and character of each unit in a given plant. He should have a good experience in terms of process and production line present in the particular plant. He should also be a successful and good designer who also understands the consequence of a wrong design or choice of a wrong material or choice of a wrong specification, etc., and their consequences on the overall performance of the system, which we call as essentially reliability. Therefore, it is important that risk assessment or hazard management in general in a broader brace looks upon a very strong dependency to capacity building of individual personnel, because human intervention is a very important logical algorithm present inherently in hazard management. If we talk about selection of failure scenarios, it is very important that once you generate the list of events, one should also look at selecting the initiating event. So, in listing the failure scenarios, after let us say event list is prepared, one should be able to identify the initiating event. Or incidents. The data requirements to identify this, the data requirements to identify the initiating event increases significantly with the inclusion of non-accident initiating events. If you include non-accident initiating event. So, it is important that one must isolate from the event list what are the possible events which can trigger accidents, what are the possible events which will not trigger what we call non-accident initiating events, because if you include all of them as a whole, then the data requirement to characterize an initiating event becomes highly complicated. While the potential range of release of sizes is tremendous, grouping are possible and one of the best solution. Therefore, instead of identifying a single event as initiating event, it is better to identify group of events. So, the technique is grouping. Grouping the events, isolating them from non-accident events will actually simplify the failure scenario, because failure scenario identification is one of the important steps in hazard management. In further detail, while grouping the events, for identifying the failure scenario, it is important that selection of appropriate hazards need to be considered. Position of the plant in relationship to the surrounding community with respect to the surrounding community is important, because we are looking for both the individual risk and societal risk. So, where is the position of the plant geographically and what is the density of population around the plant is very important. One should also consider the complexity of the process while grouping the events. One should also consider the nature of potential hazards. Are they going to cause physical hazards? Are they going to cause chemical hazards? Are they going to cause biological hazards? So, one should look at the nature of the potential hazard, then one has got to group the events which can form initiating, triggering, preceding, non-successful, non-accidental events in a given system. So, friends, we have an idea that failure scenario or preparing a list of events which can be included in a failure scenario becomes actually very complicated, because the order of failure scenario or the number of failure scenarios given in a given system becomes very enlarged. Therefore, then one can limit this failure scenario, one can limit the failure scenario by a very intelligent tool, what we call loss of containment. What we call LOC. Loss of containment event are basically the release scenarios. These events are basically the release scenarios. Release scenarios in sense, it can be a leak from the vessel, it can be a pinhole leak of a pipeline, it can be a rupture, it can be a catastrophic failure of the vessel. So, there can be many release scenarios. So, loss of containment events are essentially the release scenarios contributing to the individual or societal risk directly. So, LOCs are included when you are talking about two types of failure. One, if the frequency of occurrence of that scenario or the failure is greater than or equal to 10 power minus 9 per year, or the lethal damage which can be caused by that scenario will be equal to 1% probability. If this lethal damage occurs outside the boundary of the plant, then the issue is more serious. Then under these situations, the loss of containment events should be included definitely in the failure scenario. Failure cases in the facilities are defined in terms of loss of containment scenarios. To be more precise, they actually address the accidental releases of flammable fluids into the atmosphere. So, loss of containment also address the accidental release of chemicals or gases into atmosphere. So, loss of containment events are maybe the primary and vital events in a given risk assessment and tool. So, what are those events which can include the loss of containment in terms of release scenarios? It can be size of the process leak, whether it is a full bore rupture, whether it is a catastrophic rupture of failure of the vessel, etc. For each failure case, one should look at the release rate and release duration. Two parameters are important. One, what is the release rate and what is the release duration? Based on these two, one can do a mathematical modeling of the dispersion releases. So, this will determine, these two parameters will determine the amount of material being discharged or released in atmosphere, the amount of material being released, and this will lead to identifying, this will help us to identify the potential hazard caused by the release. Now, duration of release is dependent on the time to detect the released fluids, because you really do not know will you be able to detect the release instantaneously the moment release occurs. That is the best way to do hazard management or risk mitigation, but there may be a delay caused in identifying the release, and it can always happen after the release has occurred. So, the duration of release has got very different parameters which are inherently or implicitly affecting this. One such parameter could be the detection possibility. It means how delayed you inspected and detected it, then how much time you take to isolate the process line, because you know one of the process segment of the line is leaking, you want to isolate the line, you want to shut down the specific branch of the line. So, how much time you will take to isolate the process line and how much time you will allow the discharge. Because these three parameters will govern the duration of release, which becomes a very important parameter in all LOC events. Therefore, the total release duration can be the sum of these three. The total release duration can be the sum of the detectability time time for isolation and time allowed to discharge. So, it can be the sum of these three, which will give me Td, which is duration time. Now, if you look at the time detectability, it depends upon couple of factors. Then detectability time depends on couple of factors, depends on the monitoring of the process condition, to the availability of gas chemical leak system. So, if you may have a sensor, you may have a detector system, you may have a leak detection system in a given pipeline. So, what is its availability and what is the monitoring of the process condition you are adopting in a given system, that will control the detectability time of your any leak process. Surveillance of the process area either by the operator by a routine patrol or by a remote surveillance system is always generally used in all oil and gas industries and process sector, while the time to isolate depends on, let us say, the time to isolate, time for isolating, this depends on the emergency shutdown what we call ESD system. It also depends on various measures and systems that are put in place to prevent the loss of containment. So, what are the various systems in place to prevent the loss of containment? It all depends upon how you know the time for isolation in a given system. Okay. Such systems are called in literature repression systems. So, interestingly friends, in this lecture we discussed about the bridging between hazard management and risk assessment. We also said what are those important tools in the interesting flow chart to look at the hazard management, where consequence and frequency analysis becomes an important tool, both qualitative and quantitative risk assessment, which tells me actually the adoption of the policies by the company to limit the risk within the acceptable criteria. In the last lecture we discussed about the uncertainties and ambiguities in risk acceptance criteria. We also said what are those factors which will actually identify, help to identify the loss of containment event, which becomes a very prominent initiating event in any given system, based on which a logical tree can be established for risk assessment. I hope we are now concluding towards the risk assessment tools which are generally used for offshore structures, especially for process industries like oil and gas production systems. In couple of lectures, we will try to wind up the whole course in third module as well, and tutorials and assignments are posted. Interestingly, exercises are given in various modules of this particular course. References are listed. Please go through them in parallel. Whatever questions you have, please post them in the discussion forum. I will be glad to answer them parallelly. Thank you very much.